I mean, this is a very honest answer of why you don't want too many people in a lawsuit. That's a strictly practitioner's perspective. If the city had not acted, yeah. If you can establish, and great, and I don't know if Jack is here. I didn't see her here. But, okay, but you know, if someone from the collaborative is here, the vulnerability of their position, which the judge seized on, is that the plaintiffs there presented themselves as people who wanted to buy the post office for themselves. So they were kind of competitors for the purchase of the building rather than bringing environmental values or use values, which the city of Berkeley and the trust have brought. So they, you know, I think they still should have standing, although any time that Scalia and Roberts can knock down standing, they will do it. The Supreme Court, I mean, I say this rather bluntly, you know, professors, law teachers are supposed to be moderate. No moderation here. They have a campaign for 20 years to let commercial interests have free rein in the courts and to keep non-proprietary interests out of the courts. They hate it. You know, and a lot of federal judges think these are the worst cases. These plaintiffs are hard to deal with. Well, this is the strength of the national trust. They come in very professionally, so the judges don't hate the national trust because they know they're going to know how to handle the case. So if, you know, Baja, for example, would, in my view, and the trust, would clearly have standing if the city had not come into this. But just remember, in environmental litigation, the most credible voice is that of another public agency. And Berkeley, the city of Berkeley, is the most credible citizen voice here. The fact that it's a council united is something that the judge just cannot ignore. And by the same token, that's the role that the advisory council plays when we get to the NEPA side of the lawsuit, looking at alternatives. You know, the trust could come up with an alternative, the city could come up with an alternative, but if the federal agency charged with historic preservation makes a comment, that makes the judge will rely on that primarily to show an adequate analysis. That's what we did in the freeway case. I'm sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but it was a very good question, and just say thankfully we didn't have to do that.
I think we're all thankful that the city council is unanimous on that. There are individual citizens, you know, class action if you were to proceed with one. For example, the Great Panthers, they have to take their newsletter to 8th Street
the
location.
bulk mail facility.
Bulk mail facilities.
And the lady who is there is in training and she isn't helping in and she's stealing money from us.
They have terrible service and they're elderly people that have difficulty getting around, so there's definitely adverse impact there. This next question is, why would we give up this resource in 50 years? Don't our grandchildren matter?
They do.
Okay, yeah.
And
My answer to that is, you know, each generation has to fight its battle for itself. I mean, the reason that the post office, and it turns out now that from some of the papers we got from them, they gave us a very measly response to our Freedom of Information Act request. But in fact, even though they told us in our comments there's no way we're going to consider a lease back, they were actually toying with that, asking Hudson McDonald to consider that for 5 years. Well, 5 years is blinking the eye. But 50 years, who knows? I mean, hopefully our government will be in better shape in 50 years. And our postal, you know, they might just really want the building back so much. I'll come back to that in just a second with an Ohio case. So if we can solve the problem satisfactorily for essentially 2 generations, we have to trust that they'll be able to take care of it in that time. The Ohio story is the total converse of this story. The post office leased its building in a small Ohio town for and had the option to buy it back at the end of that lease for $300,000. Turns out the building is like worth $1 million now. It's historic, everybody loves it. And the post office has had to sue the current lessor to get their building back. And in their brief, there is this eloquent language about the importance of an historic post office. If someone from the Postal Service is here, yeah, call up the lawyers in Washington, tell them they're going to see that in our brief on the merits. So, times will change, and you just have to have faith in the future. I know Jack and I, Jack said she wanted perpetuity. And I said, lawyers have trouble with perpetuity. And her response to me was, get over it. And I can take those comments maybe a little easier than city council members. And you just can't do that. In fact, there's a rule against perpetuities, but that's another story. So, if we can solve this for 2 generations, I have faith in the future.
I may still be here, so.
Not be around when your kids. 2 last questions. Are there still vacancies on the USPS board? Well, maybe there's 3 more questions. Could the board put a halt to the $5.5 billion per year future healthcare cost fund?
I think those are beyond my.
Yeah, they're what is the phrase out of our wheelhouse or beyond our someone in the back knows the answer. I mean, the short answer is I think Congress has to change the financing, and I don't know that much about the internal workings of the post office. I think the Postal Regulatory Commission deals with the commercial side of the house and not this side, but there's someone in the back had a hand up.
Oh, she has her hand up. So how many?
In fact, there's some question as to whether.
Can you stand up and everybody can hear your answer?
This is the Board of Governors.
The Board of
Yes,
Governors.
there are vacancies, and there's some question as to whether they can even make some of the decisions they're making, because they may not have enough people on there to do this legally. That's another question. Interesting to know.
There are vacancies, and there's some question whether they even have a legal quorum now. So one more aspect of our government in action. Yeah.
Moni?
Yes? Someone in the back? I don't see your hand. Who's raising their hand? Yes, sir.
My name is Peter Dumont, and I am founder of the Star Alliance Foundation for All, which is a locally based nonprofit.
Is this a question related to the post office or the constellations of the stars? We want to stay on planet Earth. Can I take your question later? I got 2 more questions real quick. Because is this related to the post office? Okay, we'll get back to you. Should the public citizenry attend the court case? A couple of people are starting to leave. We want to make sure. So it's open to the public. They should be there no later than 8 a.m. They have to go through security. In San Francisco, can you give the details?
Yeah. It's on the 19th, courtroom 8, it's on the 19th floor of the federal courthouse, which is on Golden Gate, between Golden Gate and Turk, right behind the State Building, Civic Center, BART, 10-minute walk, 5-minute walk. But yeah, I'd get there around 7:30, 7:45 at the latest.
Yeah, I think it'll be worth the time. Judge Alsip is a pretty colorful guy. Just would suggest looking him up. He's traditionally been known to be very plaintiff friendly, and as Tony said, he sort of gave the government lawyers a hard time. So we're hoping that happens again.
And that's March 19th.
That's right.
March 19th, be there, 7:30 a.m. in San Francisco. 2 last questions. Trust versus USPO, Berkeley versus USPO. 2 separate suits, will they be consolidated? Could there be separate conclusions in your 2 cases? Is that possible?
They're related, which means that they will be, we had the separate briefing now simply because the trust filed their complaint a little later and the post office had more time to file their motion. Here on out, they'll go on the same track. The judge will issue one decision, I'm sure, that will apply to both, but consolidation is a legal term of art, and they don't need to be and likely will not be consolidated.
This is my personal question. How many hours have you both put in this case so far? At 200 to 300 an hour equals?
I should be tracking. This case sort of relates, because I'm kind of an in-house person, the broader campaign that we're working on, and there's so many interrelated parts. But as far as filing this last brief that we did today, a good 40, 50 hours.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah.
That's about what we did too. My partner and I, to prepare the complaint, which was the first complaint, and to prepare the legal papers to get a preliminary injunction. That, you know, in these types of cases, it's not like your typical slip and fall where a lawyer drafts a 5-page complaint, files it, and just does nothing. You have to do all the work up front. Between the two of us, that was about 140 hours.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, we thank you for doing that.
Pro bono and hopefully compensated at the end when you prevail. Is there a possibility that the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act will be reconsidered, if you have any knowledge of that or insight?
Well, you know, I can speak to that. We do have a government relations office in DC, and there is a staff member who we've been working with who's been talking to various sympathetic legislators, Congresswoman Lee, of course, and Congressman Serrano in the Bronx is really taking the lead on introducing some legislation. It's really hard. I think Tony alluded to the fact that you don't know how many hours you should really be investing here, because it's hard to predict if this will go anywhere. But we're continuing to talk to Boxer's staff to see if we can get a sponsor on the Senate side, to make sure that if postal reform legislation goes forward, that we have provisions in there related to historic properties.
Can we ask Senator Feinstein to have her husband withdraw?
I'd like to make a comment on my question, which was the last one.
Okay, you have a question?
There is a legal maxim which says that which is irrational is unlawful, and that is inherently unlawful, unconscionable.
Do you have a comment on inherently unconscionable?
There's a lot of law out there that doesn't make sense.
Susan?
I just want to comment that, you know, legislation over the last couple of years, I know Mike Lonergan can probably speak on this as well, if you're interested, keeps being introduced that have been favorable, including the repeal or amendment of this 2006 Postal Enhancement and Accountability Act. But as you know, all the legislation dies after a certain period if it's not enacted. So here we are again at that point of having to have legislation reintroduced.
So everyone knows what that is about, right? Probably most people do it. 75 years in advance of even people being alive, that they have to prepay their health care fund.
Which is
It's
crazy.
the
On the
only
one hand, they're trying
employer.
to privatize. Who
Yeah.
are they now going to pay for 75 years in
Yeah.
advance? The person whose job they're now trying to abolish.
Right. So it's
Sort of a
nonsense.
conflict, right there.
So legally, the challenge that's currently before us, if you were to put your odds and throw the dice and give some expectation, I mean, NAACP lawyers, since the 6th grade I wanted to be a lawyer when I went on to practice law. Selma, I've seen it 4 times. In the case, you know, when they're in court and they get the injunction and George Wallace gets backed down and they're allowed to then march without restriction to some extent. Racially restrictive covenants is the phrase I think of when you say covenants.
Yeah.
But covenants can be good, and so best case scenario, we save the post office for public use, it stays a post office, and then your next scenario, plan B, would be the covenants that are enforced by someone.
City of Berkeley.
City of Berkeley.
City of Berkeley, yeah. The covenant we've worked on, and the State Historic Preservation Officer, you know, we had a tour, she came down, you know, almost begging the city to agree to be the covenant holder because they know the city has the resources to do it well. Baja could be another covenant holder, but better the city. And where the post office has blinked is they don't want to compensate the city for the cost of doing that. There's room for negotiation there. That's the sort of thing that just got prematurely cut off. What the post office was proposing would actually have made the city more restrictive than if there were no covenant at all. Because without a covenant, the city still has this plenary land use authority, which it couldn't fully exercise, and it wouldn't get any of the benefits. Where a covenant goes, it reaches areas that zoning law doesn't reach. How well you're going to prepare the building, steps you're gonna take to ensure that, you know, the building stays in one piece, the artwork is protected.